let's get on with reacting better with Redux. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about what is Redux. So who made it? Why did they make it? What is its purpose? We're going to talk about how to Redux React. So how did we get to a state where we need Redux? What do we need Redux for? What is Redux? And then we're going to talk about the properties that we get from using React with Redux as a scalable architecture. And we'll compare that with the MVC type frameworks out there. And for those who don't know, the MVC frameworks, that's Model View Controller. So what is React? Okay? So and this is straight from the Facebook website, it is a declarative, efficient, and flexible JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And it does that by using components to declare little bits of reusable UI. And all these components that we declare are going to utilize a concept called virtual DOM. And so that's another thing that we're going to talk about here just momentarily. But first, let's get through some history here. So React was created by someone at Facebook named Jordan Wanek, and it was created and modeled after a component library for PHP called XHP, and that was just a way to describe components in PHP, and it would output components. And PHP is a whole other story. So the React started as an internal library at Facebook, but was prompted to become more of an external tool when Instagram started using it. And when Instagram started using it, they kind of said, hey, we have this cool new tool that it's really fast and flexible, but it's not easy because it's very integrated with Facebook. And so Jordan Wanek, when Instagram started needing to use it, was split off into his own team. A big team was created, and they worked on React. And they decided to open source it for all of us, which is, I think, fantastic. All right, so let's move into the DOM. And so the DOM is an interface for an interface for JavaScript to communicate with HTML documents. So the DOM is really a description of what HTML looks like when you go to a website. It's a data structure of HTML elements. And it also has an API for manipulating the DOM for JavaScript. So in JavaScript, we can talk to the DOM, and we can read from the DOM, and we can write to the DOM. So we can make elements appear, we can make them disappear. That's the general purpose of the DOM, is providing a way to view an HTML document in a programmatic way. And that's why it's the entry point for dynamic websites. So what is the VDOM? So I threw that out there, and you're probably wondering, what is the VDOM? We're going to show a little example of the differences between these two. But just as a short description, it's a JavaScript representation of the DOM. So it's not the API that directly communicates with the DOM. It's a JavaScript representation of it. And it's used in React to decide what we should update. And so when React became a necessity for Facebook, they had a lot of problems in their websites where they had like the chat system, and the chat system needed to update very quickly. And there's this huge API, there's this huge framework, just this big world of UI stuff to update, and the chat box is this tiny little screen, a tiny little bit in the lower right corner, and it's taking up so much processing power just to get it to update. And so the virtual DOM is React's way of deciding what actually needs to update. So React creates a virtual DOM tree and then does a technique called reconciling. So every time that React runs, it renders a big picture, a snapshot of the UI. So we write code that gives a description of the UI. And that description of the UI is compared to the old description of the UI. And we build a difference between the two. And when we have a difference, we can target only the things that have changed. So that's what the big deal about this VDOM is. It also allows us to batch those changes to the DOM for minimal waste. And again, that's done because we can run several snapshots faster than we can even write to the DOM. And in all those snapshots, we can combine those snapshots and build a list of things that we need to change. And then we can group them all at once, fire them off, DOM's been updated for you. And all this happens behind the scenes in React. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you guys, some examples. So I have this example DOM, okay? And this isn't going to be a totally one-to-one, but it's going to be close. And so I just have an HTML document. And this HTML document is pretty standard. It's got a head with a link, that style sheet. I wouldn't have included it, but when I show you this, it won't blind you because I've styled it. And so we'll look at the real chunk here, which is the body section. And this has an ID of root. And this div has a class, my div, and we have some spans in here, and another div. And actually, we can view that. We can actually view that in Chrome. If I had left it open. We can actually view Chrome here. No, yeah, there we go. And got it on my other monitor. Nope, a little high. Sorry as I snaggle with this. Okay, so we can actually inspect this DOM. Okay, so we saw the description of it, and here is the description of it again. So we have all that content that we saw in the HTML file, but the DOM is basically these little blocks that we have access to here in the developer tools. In fact, just to show you how that works, I can even dump. I can even dump number 0, which was the one that I had focused, which is div another div. And so this is a JavaScript accessible element. So this is the DOM as it stands. And writing to this for really big applications can be really, really hard to figure out what needs to change. Now we've looked at that, let's go back to some code examples. So in here, what we actually have is kind of like a pseudo React render method. And so this render method is actually going to do the same thing as that HTML document. So we have... Lost my microphone. Let's see if I can not stretch that out. Okay, so we have this function, and this is compiled, so it's going to look a little bit different from the arrow functions, but it's nothing we haven't seen before. It's just an anonymous function. So we have this React.createElement, and we pass it HTML, and it has a React create element for head, and then one for body, and one for that section, and the divs, and the spans. And this is just JavaScript, really. But this JavaScript builds some output somewhat similar to this, where we have this thing that we've built using function calls as an object with some arrays in it. So that HTML is really an element type, an object with element type HTML with no properties on it. And it has some children, which has the head child and the body child. And these are just representations of those elements. And so that's what the VDOM is really doing, is we are generating these snapshots, and we're using these snapshots to update the UI. All right, so that kind of sums up DOM versus VDOM. So now we're going to talk about React and Angular. And the reason we're going to talk about React and Angular is at the end of this, I'm going to show you the difference in scalability between the popular architecture model view controller versus the architecture that we're going to walk through today, which is Redux with React. Okay, so today let's look at, if I click the right one, Angular, which is a true MVC framework. So what is MVC framework? I've thrown that out a few times. It means Model View Controller. So what that means is we have a model, and this model is a concept in JavaScript. We saw those objects. A model is basically kind of like an object, and it has some hooks out to the view. And the view can talk to the model, and it can update from the model. So it reads from the model, it displays to the users in the view what the model looks like, and in some way that's designed in the view. And we do that through templates. And then we have a controller which kind of binds everything together. So we swap the view in and out using said controller. And in fact, I'm going to get back to that in just a second. I'm going to go over just this slide here. So I mentioned that we use templating language to describe views. And I also mentioned that we have kind of like this binding situation going on between the views and the models. But really what we should look at is this diagram. This diagram actually makes it a lot easier for me to communicate what's going on here. So in Angular or MVC frameworks, Angular is just the most popular one out there right now for the JavaScript world. We have kind of this shape. We have some view, we have some model, we have some controller. We have these arrows kind of directing the flow of data here. So for the view, this is what the user sees. This is user-facing. This is where they click on buttons. This is where they see data. This model is where data lives. So this model holds all the things that we've pulled from the database on the back end. It hosts any user state. So, I'm currently loading another view. Well, the model knows that I'm loading another view. That's where that state stays. And the controller is kind of what binds actions in the view to the model. So when I click on something in the view, it fires some sort of action off, which talks to the model, updates the view. And the reason there's another arrow going back from the controller is because the controller is able to swap views in and out of the user's kind of area. So you can have multiple views, and the controller can decide which ones are present for the users. And so this is the basic shape of an MVC library. And so React is the V in MVC. It is a view library. And this is very important. That's why it's so big. It is just a view library. It has no model. It has no controller. Let's see if I can sync up my... Okay. So React, it's just a view library. Doesn't ship with a controller or a model. And it's just a library that describes UI. That's it. Nothing extra on it. We write our UI as functions or as classes. We don't have any templates. There's no additional languages that we need to learn. It's just JavaScript, and we'll get some HTML in there through JSX in our next examples. So let's talk about the core concepts of React. So our three core ideas in React, and those are components, props, which is shorthand for properties, and state. Okay? And I'm going to walk through examples of that, and we're going to head over to our terminal window real quick. And for those that are following along, you can run npm install. Well, I'm going to assume you've already npm installed by now, but you can run npm start, and what this is going to do is it's going to start a service which is going to let us interact with our code today. So our code examples are going to be located at localhost port 8080. Let me just move this over here so that it's visible. Okay, so localhost port 8080 after you've started it, and don't open up that. I think it's F11, right? Yep, okay, there we go. So localhost port 8080 after you've npm started it, and let's look at the code for React. Let's just get some basic ideas about what React looks like. So let's start with our component demo. Okay? So we talked about our arrow functions. So here they are again. But now you're going to notice something strange. We have HTML inside of our JavaScript. Bizarre. That's because we have a special compiler, transpiler, that's basically taking this H1 and converting it into those function calls we showed you when I demonstrated the virtual DOM. So H1 compiles down to a React create element with H1 as its type. And it has great news as its child. Content it's another component. So we have this function that returns a paragraph. And that paragraph has React utilizes functional components. And then we have our component demo, which just takes header and content. So you notice that we've actually just, instead of calling the function header, we have surrounded those in HTML brackets and put it into our HTML that this function's making, just like HTML. Header looks like an HTML tag. Content looks like an HTML tag. And we're just going to put this in a div. And that's kind of the simplicity here with React is I am describing HTML with some functions. I just have these routines that generate our functions. And that reusability that I was talking about comes in the fact that this content can be a self-contained description of what's necessary to make a content component. And all we need to do is just drop it here in place, and there we go. And so I have a little bit of a framework that does all the wiring up to display this component demo. So why don't we move over and look at how this looks. So here's our component. And great news, React utilizes functional components. So let's move on to the next example. So we kind of have an idea of what the components look like. Let's look at what these props are that I'm talking about. So this is going to be a very similar example from what I had before. So this is the props demo. And you're going to notice some destructuring that we had talked about before. So here's that destructuring that I'm talking about. Properties are handed to our React components as objects. And these objects list all the properties that they were called with. And so this is going to be a little bit of a talk here. So let's take a look at text, per se. This is a property of content. It looks very similar to an HTML tag property, right? I have an attribute that I'm assigning to content. In React, we use the nomenclature props. So this text is like a custom property that we've designed. And we're going to pass text, which is this variable text, which is components can be called of custom properties, into content. So now our content takes a prop of text, and it displays text. And you'll notice there's some other syntax here, just to point it out what's going on. These brackets here inside of the HTML say, run JavaScript here. It doesn't say run a different language. So in Angular or Knockout or any of the other ones, you might have a separate templating language. No. We open up these brackets. This is now JavaScript. And I am saying, here's this expression, text. So inside of this paragraph, we will display our property text. Okay? You'll notice a funky one, children. And I didn't pass children here. But I do have content in between the opening header and the closing header tag. And that is, this is the children property. And that's what it is. You can pass any number of things as children to your tags. So here's another way where React can be great in reusing components. Is I can describe components that take other components and wrap those components, just like in HTML. I can put a div on the page, and I can wrap it in. I can wrap it in another div or a section or or a table. Well, let's not get too far. So we get this ability to pass many things. And so this text string is a valid child. And that's cool. We should be able to pass strings to HTML-looking things, right? So this header should get the children of this text. So our header destructures children out and plops it right inside of H1. And we're going to use a very similar example. So this should look very similar. It's just the data that we're piping into all this is a little different. Oh, one last bit. Our class name, you'll notice I'm using class name here. Class is a reserved word. So there's little bits about React you'll learn over time. Not many, though. Okay, so let's jump back to our example. And we're just going to head over to the props page. And so now we've updated. We're now looking at this is the children property. That's what we passed into our header. And components can be called with custom properties. And that's what we passed into our content component. All right, so that sums up kind of the basics of properties in React. So let's move on to the state demo. So, state. This is the third concept that's very important in React. It's state. And this is UI state. And when I say UI state, this timer is a pretty good example, right? So I have some sort of, this is a timer class. So I told you that we could write these as functions, and we can also write these as classes. Stateful components are classes. They're a class description, and they have this function called render in it. And render is that description of how we're going to draw it. But the reason that we have the class framework around that render function are that I have a stateful component. And so it's called timer because when this component mounts on the page, when React puts it on the page after it reconciles and it's like, hey, I need to put something on the page, it's this timer, put it here, I've created it for you, do it. We're going to mount it, and we're going to set state. We're going to set this interval when it mounts, and all it's going to do is it's going to call this method on this, the timer that we've created, and we're going to increase the time. We're going to increment it by 1. And then, after we've created the interval, we're going to set it with this .set state, and here's that shorthand. So we're creating an object timer, object with timer in it, and we're setting that in state. So what that does is we're setting this state that we've created in our constructor later. So we've mounted, and now we're going to update timer to whatever set interval returns. It's an identifier. And time, we will update whenever this interval fires, which is at 1,000 milliseconds. Following that, we have a component will unmount. We're going to do some cleanup of that state. So here, what we're doing here is we're clearing the interval of that state because this component is going to leave the page. It no longer exists. It's no longer going to be visible. It's never going to be used again. We need to clean up our state. We need to clean up this timer that we've created. So we're going to clear the interval. I'm not going to bother setting any state just because it's going to be destroyed. This won't be remounted. Once this is called, it's never remounted. And that'll be it. So what this is, this constructor, we're creating a new instance of the timer component. We're starting that state with some initial state, which is time 0, timer null. And then we have these properties, component will mount and component will unmount, which handle the life cycle of that state. They handle the whens of where the state, the whens of the state's beginning, the where it is, and the when it leaves. So it's the life cycle of it. And there are many more life cycle methods, but I wanted to keep this short. So we'll focus on component will mount and component will unmount. And here we have this render method where we pull the time out of this dot state, and we're going to render that with a header and the time. And we'll insert the time here with that bracket notation. So if we hop over to our example, find my mouse, click on state. We have our simple timer now showing, and you can see that every second, because 1,000 milliseconds, we are increasing the time by 1, and we're re-rendering that. React is doing all of that for us under the covers. I told it to set the state, and React did everything else for us. All I did was describe what it's going to look like when it has these values. So when that state updates, it re-renders this thing, and only this thing, because that's the only thing that's changed. And so this is that state. This is the state concept.